Um, 1986. Um, my father is the eldest of five siblings, four sisters, one little brother. As such, he had to essentially help each one of them migrate to the US. So, being the eldest means you eat last. And therefore, we were the last family out of his side of the family to ever make it to the States. We're from a small village called Dingucha, which is about an hour and a half, roughly, outside of the nearest main city would be Ahmedabad. But Dingucha is a very, very typical rural village in India. Pretty much no electricity, at least at that time, no electricity. I mean, there's electricity now, but back then there was none. There was no real like water per se. There were no toilets per se. You go out in the public, uh, so we came from that type of place. My parents were farmers. We were essentially farmers. Um, and so I was only 6 years old when we migrated to the States. I have two older brothers. Each one of us is about 3 years apart. So I was six, my middle brother was nine, and my oldest brother was roughly 12, 13 years old. None of us spoke English. So mom, dad, and the three brothers came to the States to New Jersey first because that's where my parents, sisters, and brother were living. So typical migration story, you take care of your own, right, and help them get settled. So initially, we actually lived with our aunts and uncles until we got our footing and, had enough money to at least get an apartment. Um, the first apartment we lived in, I shouldn't call it an apartment, it's a studio, was essentially a one-room apartment for the five of us. We slept on the floor, very common story for a lot of folks. Um, and then gradually over time, as we progressed, things got better, but it took a while, decades, for lack of better words. Um, so me being younger than my brothers, I guess I would say I had it easier than them, given that I at least got to learn the English language from the beginning, whereas it was way harder for them. So imagine going to eighth grade, you not speaking English, and now you're just in another country, you know, you don't know anything and you got a lot to catch up on. So I would say my oldest brother had it definitely the hardest. At the same time, he has to take care of us two younger fools as well and help provide and, I guess enable my mom and dad. So my mom and dad did, the odd jobs until they could like kind of do anything of their own. Um, my dad, his progression was essentially, I would say, the first 5 years, he was really just helping out others at their businesses. Whether it was a convenience store, one time I think it was a Hallmark store, Hallmark gift cards. He was, just doing stock, making sure there were gift cards on the shelves, things like that. But learned from the process. Eventually, he partnered with one of our other relatives in another store. And then that led to him eventually partnering with someone else in a much bigger store and so forth and so on. But he was always into some retail store. By the time he retired, he had a toy store in a town in northern Jersey. But it was one of those legacy toy stores that had been there since the 1950s. Um, where most of it, and that town is primarily senior citizens nowadays. So a lot of old people live there, and they remember going to that toy store when they were little. So some of the things in that toy store were just really odd, like toys from way back in the day that no kid wants today. You wouldn't really find like electronics or video games or anything like that. You would find like the Red Ryder, and things like that, or board games, Monopoly, and Wheel of Fortune type of thing. Um, and there were three aisles in that toy store, I remember. Aisle number one was toys. Aisle number two was houseware. So any random thing you would expect in like an old person's house, like dollies. Who the hell knows what a dolly is? But you can find it at my dad's store. Aisle number three was hardware, hammers and nails and wires and cables and things like that. So I used to go there after school and essentially help out, ring the cash register, stock shelves, things like that. Just basically try to stay out of trouble. Plus, I didn't speak English, so what else was I going to do? Um, but yeah, growing up, I think hardest for the elder brother because he had a lot more to catch up on, whereas I was actually just starting with my ABCs. Most people didn't actually. I didn't speak to a lot of people, so I would say I was not very talkative early in my childhood because I had nothing to say in English. Didn't know the language, and so I was pretty quiet kid to the point where I remember when they first put me in school, when people would ask me for my name, I would say my real name's Chirag, but no one would pronounce it. So then they just gave me a name and started calling me Charlie because my hair used to stick up like Charlie Brown. How fitting, right? Brown. Um, and so naturally, the same kids that are in first grade are your peers in second and third and fourth. So Charlie kind of stuck. So I've been called Charlie since 1986. Not because I wanted to, I just didn't know how to correct anybody, and I wasn't going to have that conversation. So it naturally stuck to the point where now everybody calls me that, and that's how people know me. Um, Fast forward, I would say after the first 10 years of living essentially in poverty, my brother got out of school. Um, and he did his thing. He was an accountant, did his corporate route. All of us kind of learned English and whatnot. So things got a little bit better once you get that footing and settle in. Um, I was essentially a good kid and a bad kid, a very confused individual. Good kid in that if you looked at my report cards and whatnot, I was great on paper. I was terrible outside. So I guess you could say young kid trying to figure out who the hell he is, right? Got a lot of conflict and clashing happening both culturally, but also with just essentially people. Um, so I was trying to fit into a lot of areas, which may have been a good thing, but also it's a terrible thing, right? Because you're just always trying to fit in. But it was a good thing because I got to experience a lot. So I hung out with the goth kids. I hung out with the um, athletes. I was a baseball player, pretty good at that during high school as well. Played Little League and all that good stuff. But then I'd also hang out with, bunch of gangsters, right? So I was everywhere. I was the jock, but I was also, you know, a really bad kid off the streets, hanging out with the wrong type of crowd. So, coming out of high school, even though academically I had great grades, I initially had a full scholarship to my first university, but got kicked out within my first semester. So I was not just kicked out, some people get, a little slap on the wrist, some people get suspended. No, I was expelled. And for all the wrong reasons, they were like, we do not want you at this university. So my ultimately, after I had gotten kicked out, it was very hard to tell mom and dad and everybody that, hey, I'm expelled from school. You're, the kid that you're expecting to be a doctor or whatever in the future is now like not even allowed at university anymore. So at 18, I actually ended up because I had to pretend I was going somewhere. So they didn't know. So I ended up actually working. I went to a staffing agency and they staffed me to do some data entry work at a telecom company. They sold calling cards. Back in the day, you actually had calling cards with minutes on them, credits. And you would use that to use the payphone and call from there, or use from home. You would use have to type in a bunch of numbers or punch in a bunch of numbers, and that's how you would make calls. And if you wanted to call internationally, it was like, $1 a minute type of thing. So you had these cards. You used to find them in the pamphlets behind the seats on airplanes. There were a lot of advertisements for them. But anyways, I ended up doing data entry for them, and it was a short assignment, a few weeks, but they saw something in me, liked me, whatnot, asked me to come back, and gave me a full-time offer. So that was actually my first full-time like corporate job, was doing account management or sales, accounts receivables and payables, for a telecom company that at the time was only about 100 people, but eventually became, a nine-figure company. And I remember, since I didn't know anything, I'm 18 years old, I don't know what to ask for. I remember them asking me, "Hey, how much do you want?" And I was like, "Whatever you'll give me." I wish I had asked for more, but they gave me whatever. But the experience was definitely worthwhile. So my first job was really at 18 years old, if you don't count like, flipping pizzas at Papa John's. Um, so that was my first job. I was there almost a year, until I realized I got to go back to school and finish with my peers. Um, so long story short, I applied to a university that had rolling admission. They asked what happened at my prior university and why I was kicked out and all of that jazz. I told them the truth and told them, "Hey, around the wrong people at the wrong time, judge me on my academics." And they did, luckily. I got in. That school was at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Um, and they were slightly, I would say they were different than most other universities. They have what's called a trimester as opposed to your typical dual semester. They also are a co-op school, meaning they actually want you to not to do the fourth semester and work, which was good, because it meant like most of the students, maybe not every, but I would say the majority of the people I ran into, they just had their head on straight. And there were a lot of commuters, so people who just were busy. They had to get from A to B after class, so they didn't have time to like BS with you, which was great because that's what I needed at the time. And so I surrounded myself with just some really smart people who were just, bookworms, um, and me with my bandana and all, right? But eventually became, academically stout, I guess, whatever you want to call it, and did really well. And what I would do to catch up for the year that I had lost my first year with 0 credits, is I would get permission to take more credits than were allowed, the maximum. So most universities won't let you take more than 20 credits, but I would take like 23 credits or 24 credits to make up for that year I lost, so that I could still graduate with the people I should have graduated with. So 3 years of that, and I was able to graduate on time, as if I had never lost that first year. Um, and because I was taking so many credits, I did it in a way where it allowed me to be like a triple major. So I was a finance, international business, and also an information systems major. So I kind of had the finance, the business side of things, for lack of better words, and the technology side. I had the surface level knowledge, so that if I wanted to switch, I could switch in case something got really boring. Um, I guess you could say it's sort of the backup plan, right? And so throughout it, I guess I was always looking to hack my way through college, hack my way to a job, hack my way through like, hey, if I want something, this is how I get it. And so I would always just reverse engineer everything. So, the same way I was able to graduate in 3 years with a triple major, I would just look at, okay, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and then reverse engineer and figure out how much time I had to do it. Um, and so similarly, I wanted to get into the finance world, preferably at one of what we call the bulge bracket companies, the JP Morgans, Morgan Stanleys, back in the day, Credit Suisse, the CSFB type of thing, Goldman Sachs. And to do that, you had to work in an investment bank. Of course, no investment bank recruited where I went to school. They only recruit at the Ivy League schools. So luckily, I was able to hack through that as well. So what I did is every summer And sometimes even during the school year, I would work so that I could really, pad my resume and make it stand out compared to like my peers. And it started small. I mean, nothing fancy. I think my first co-op or internship was with Pep Boys. And for if you're not American, you don't know what Pep Boys is. It's Matty, Mo, and Jack, the tire store, essentially. They're everywhere. They're the mechanic shop, tire shop in the US. And I used to do the tax returns for stores all over the West Coast, which is odd given I'm 18, 19 years old. But that was the task. So that's what I did for one summer, which let me then get into, at the time, this is early 2000s, actually 2000, digitization was like the new thing, not having paper at an office. And so every company was trying to digitize everything. And so my next gig was to digitize things, paper at Cigna Healthcare. So I worked in Philadelphia at Cigna Healthcare as an intern, essentially just, scanning images. Okay. Not fun, nothing sexy, but again, this is what you got to do, right? But that helped me ultimately then get the following summer, get an internship at JP Morgan, which is what I wanted. And getting an internship there was essentially unless you screwed it up, you were pretty much guaranteed a role after college in one of the JP Morgan businesses. But if the one I wanted was the one they wouldn't let me into. So they gave me offers into a bunch of others, but they just weren't as sexy as what I thought was sexy back then. And so I remember my senior year, I was applying to a lot of schools, again, just hacking away. One thing I became really good at was I realized interviewing and getting the interview was typically most people's problem. Like first, you couldn't get the interview, but the second, you usually screwed up on the interview, even if you got it. So what I did in my junior year is I actually got certified in resume writing, and then I got certified in interviewing. And so doing that, I had a killer resume that really stood out. And so when I needed a job after college or like right before you graduate, I had ton of offers. I could pretty much do whatever I wanted. And one of them stood out, which was an offer from GE Capital. And back then they used to have these, and they still do now. Now it's very common, but back then it wasn't very common. But they had these leadership programs where they would like rotate you from one business to another, to another, to another. And after 3 years, at GE, it was 3 years, 6 months each, so 6 rotations. At other companies nowadays, it's 2 years, and you do 1 or 2 rotations. But GE really puts you through the gauntlet. And so it was a 3-year rotational program. And they were known as one of the better companies to like actually get accepted into. And somehow I got into it, which was odd. But I got into it not necessarily for their business or financial side of the leadership program. I got into it for the information management side of it, which is essentially means they're going to groom you to be a CIO. All right. If you get into it for the financial side, they're grooming you to be a CFO eventually, and so forth and so on. So I guess it did help to major in information systems and have 3 majors, because what I thought I was going to be doing, which is working at an investment bank, ultimately ended up being, no, you're going to be on a CIO track for a bank, which is very different. So I did that, realized after my first year of doing that, even though everybody around me was fantastic, superstars, all superstars over there, I still wanted something sexier. So I, left that and ended up at Accenture, which is a management consulting firm out of New York City, and worked there. And that was good and bad. I was, again, surrounded by really smart people, met some amazing people, got to work with some cool clients and things like that. But at the same time, I just didn't feel like I was being challenged enough. I felt like I was using 10% of my brain. I mean, the majority of the time, you were just creating presentations and decks and analysis and whatnot. And I had already done a lot of this before. So uh, I was hoping they would just see, you know, what untapped talent lied within me. And of course they didn't. So they made me want to follow this track. I'm too impatient for that. So luckily what happened is one of my clients saw the untapped talent. Um, so right time, right place. This was during the mortgage crisis. I was involved with helping mark to market all the derivatives, essentially all the mortgages in the US. So essentially, my first assignment was essentially like a $500 billion portfolio to market that. And I had a great individual who was my mentor at the time. He was the head of strategy for the trading desk for this very massive company that runs most of the mortgages in the US. And he taught me a whole bunch of things that no one would have ever taught me. He spent a lot of time on me. Um, and then he quit. And at the time that he quit, I was a consultant. I wasn't an employee. So the company had to hire me. And so, of course, I got to ask for whatever I want. And I realized, okay, hey, make yourself critical and you can pretty much do whatever you want. And so I had gotten into a position at the right place at the right time, doing work that was actually critical. So they couldn't get rid of me. In fact, they had to actually hire me full time. So they negotiated whatever they had to negotiate with my prior employer and said, hey, we're just going to steal this guy from you guys. That we left amicably. I ended up moving down to Washington, D.C. and working for this, mortgage-backed securities firm. And now most of my peers were actually my consultants because I was now the client. Did that for several years, after which the the sister company, the larger company that did the same thing, mortgage-backed securities, had the same issue. And there's not a big or a large amount of people that had done what we had done. So word travels pretty quickly as to, hey, who did this at company X? Long story short, they found me, called me, and said, hey, we need you to do the same thing for even a much larger portfolio, $1 trillion portfolio. And I said, well, I'd have to quit. But if I were to come help you, I need my own team. And you have to hire my company. It didn't take them long to come back and say, done. We'll hire your company and be here as soon as you can be here, and you'll be a consultant, but you got to manage this very massive multi-billion dollar program. You're going to be one of the leads on it. And so left, called my brother and said, hey, I have no idea how to start a company. I'm only 25. Can you help me start this company? And gave him a name for it. He helped me register it, sent the information, and next thing you know, I'm now officially a vendor at one of the biggest government-run entities out there. And so then I said, okay, I need a team now, because I said I'll only do this if I have a team. That's mine. And so I asked all of my Accenture buddies if they'd like to come work for me. And all of them said, yeah, why not? So I said, hey, look, you can get paid more. So all we have to do is go do this body of work for the next few years, and then make a lot of money. And so long story short, my first company started because you made yourself critical and people recognized your name and then passed it on. And so that got me into a very big company, which made it much easier to get into the next one and the next one and the next one. So at one point, I had over 40 people that worked at my company, of whom we were essentially a consulting firm. So I was handsomely paid, let's just say that. But we were young. All of us were in our mid-20s, I would say, at the time. And we looked it. We looked like we were 18 years old walking through the hallways. And so someone needed to pop that ego, and it happened real quick. My mentor at this next company was the chief security officer, and well, sorry, not chief accounting officer. And obviously her job is to do the books, the accounting books for this $1 trillion portfolio. And she also taught me a lot, but also put me in my place. So that was great. I learned a ton from her and eventually was able to build my business while also consulting. So I made a good amount of money, which allowed me to do a lot of things very quickly, travel the world, work from wherever I want. They couldn't fire me. And, we were essentially just working all the time, but having a great time when we were off. I eventually sold the pipeline of that business. So that was, I would say, my first big money in this space. And then I did a whole bunch of things I probably shouldn't have done because I didn't know enough. Um, and so I've tried, for example, let's talk about some losses. I tried to start with a few partners, the National Volleyball League in America. So like the NFL or NBA, there is no such national league for volleyball. So we try to build teams for that. Um, Created the largest facility for volleyball in the East Coast United States, and quickly learned how much electricity costs and how much keeping the lights on costs and how much getting permits could really derail you. And so that didn't last very long, but it was fun while it lasted. We lost our shirt, lost all that money that we had made. So back to zero. Okay. But would I probably redo it? Yeah, I'd probably do the same thing again. At the time, given the circumstances, it was a lot of fun and it was a nice venture. But you learn from it. You take those lessons and you try not to make the same mistakes again, right? Um, so that business eventually wound down. We lost our shirts, so had to figure out what's next. Um, I was then invited to partner with a few folks to work in the startup industry. And that's what we'll talk about next.